very much, and thank you for inviting me in. It's exciting and a little daunting to be giving the first talk launching this festival, bringing together people from such diverse areas of research and expression around our common interest in the oceans. I understand my role today as opening up the question of how the seas have been represented in literature to frame my own research and areas of study in a way that could highlight their value for other kinds of questions about the history and practice of the marine environment. So rather than focusing on my book, The Novel in the Sea, as I had originally envisioned, I think I want to be very schematic, but introduce you to what I think are two fundamental Western ways of representing the waterways of the globe. The first is what I'm going to call the poetic way of imagining these waterways as an opportunity for aesthetic appreciation. And the second is what I'll call the pragmatic imagination of the waters as an opportunity to dramatize the human capacity for practical action. So I owe this distinction between the poetic and the pragmatic imagination of the waters to the American journalist, humorist, and novelist Mark Twain, when he described a fundamental shift in his relation to the aquatic space. And this shift occurs in the first part of Life in the Mississippi, which was published in 1883. Twain works as a pilot in the late 1850s until the start of the American Civil War, and some people have said if there hadn't been a Civil War, he might have never gone on to a career as a writer. At the time he was a pilot, the banks of the Mississippi, which is the fourth longest river in the world, following the Nile, the Amazon, and the Yangtze, were extraordinarily unstable. The levee engineering projects of the later 19th century had not yet been undertaken. And in fact, they were in the works when Twain published Life in the Mississippi, and he was skeptical of their outcome. He wrote 10,000 river commissions, this was the organization charged with this, with the minds of the world at their back, cannot tame that lawless stream, cannot curb it or confine it, cannot say to it, go here, go there, and make it obey, cannot save a shore which it is sentenced, cannot bar its path with an obstruction which it will not tear down, dance over, and laugh at. To pilot safely, as Twain describes, he had to memorize the banks and markers on the entire course he navigated, which in his case was about 1,250 miles, and then retaining this map in his memory, compare it to the shifts that had occurred since he had last followed its course. But the price of this arduous apprenticeship, in his words, was the loss of the ability to appreciate the beauty of the many majestic scenes he encountered. So this is the first quote I have up there. When I had mastered the language of this water and had come to know every trifling feature that bordered the great river as familiarly as I knew the letters of the alphabet, I had made a valuable acquisition. But I had lost something too. I had lost something which could never be restored to me while I lived. All the grace, the beauty, the poetry had gone out of the majestic river. So it's with the grace, the beauty, and the poetry of the waters that I want to start. And then after I give you some examples of that, I'll turn to a more pragmatic relationship. And in fact, Twain is already suggesting that the pragmatic relationship has a literary correlate as well. He talks about the book of the waters and learning to read the face of the water. He says, the face of the water in time became a wonderful book, a book that was a dead language to the uneducated passenger, but which told its mind to me without reserve, and this is after he's learned to become a pilot. There never was so wonderful a book written by man, never one whose interest was so absorbing, so unflagging, so sparklingly renewed with every reperusal. And here comes the contrast between the poetic and the pragmatic way of looking at the water. The passenger who could not read it was charmed with the peculiar sort of faint dimple on its surface on the rare occasion when he did not overlook it altogether. But to the pilot, that was an italicized passage. Indeed, it was more than that. It was a legend of the largest capitals with a string of shouting exclamation points at the end of it. For it meant that a wreck or a rock was buried there that could tear the life out of the strongest vessel that ever floated. It is the faintest and simplest expression the water ever makes, and the most hideous to a pilot's eye. In truth, the passenger who could not read this book saw nothing but all manner of pretty pictures in it, painted by the sun and shaded by the clouds, whereas to the trained eye, these were not pictures at all, but the grimmest and most dead earnest of reading matter. If Twain allies this view of the water as an objective contemplation, as an object of contemplation with landscape and poetry, it's because this poetic view was prominent in Romantic lineage of landscape poetry, which used the seascape, like other landscapes, as the opportunity for metaphoric expressions about the human psyche and existential questions about the human condition. So I know you're all familiar with prominent poets in this seascape lineage. They include Byron, Shelley, Keats, Baudelaire, Swinburne, Rimbaud, Valéry, many, many others. I'm just going to give you a few examples from this poetic way of imagining the water. So, to the arduous labor of Twain's pilots scanning the surface for the most subtle patterns which could indicate danger of the deep, compare the vision of the sea in John Keats's sonnet on the sea, which is from 1817. Here Keats invites those weary with life on land to come to enjoy the sea as a respite from human history and practice, soothing to our eyes, unlocking the gates to a fairy kingdom, even in our secular words, so in his world. In his sonnet on the sea, he writes, "O ye who have your eyeballs vexed and tired, feast them upon the wideness of the sea. O ye whose ears are dinned with uproar rude, or fed too much with cloying melody, sit ye near some old cavern's mouth and brood." So the immense expanse of the sea here is not only an invitation to relaxed contemplation, it's an invitation into a different realm of sound, one that does not resemble uproar rude and cloying melody, which is presumably the hubbub of life on land. Instead, the sea is the gateway to the language of nature, with its eternal whisperings, and to a kind of supernatural sound as well, a sound Keats aligns with pagan practices, the sea nymphs choiring, and as a literary critic, I could do a lot with that word choiring, but I won't, I'll spare you, rather than with a Christian God. It's a paradoxical song that comes from brooding, pointing, of course, to the poet's own creation, as in so many romantic works. Now, Keats was no sailor, and his poetic view of the sea might be tied to an ignorance like those of Twain's passengers. But it's also found in works of romantics who had a practical relation to the ocean. So I'm sure you all know that George Gordon Lord Byron was a yachtsman, and he was also the grandson of a professional naval officer, John Byron. And early in his career, John Byron had been involved in a famous mutiny and wreck, the wreck of the Wager, which was one ship in the squadron that set out with Lord Anson on his disastrous circumnavigation of the globe from 1740 to 1744. But when John Byron's grandson characterized the ocean in his poetry, he imagined it as a place outside history, according to the aesthetic of the sublime, which is an awful in the sense of full of awe, overpowering, humbling experience that challenges the limits of human reason. And here's just a brief citation from some of Byron's most famous lines about the ocean as the image of eternity, the throne of the invisible, dark heaving, boundless, endless, and sublime. Whereas Twain noted in The Surface of the Water patterns where the pilot looks for guides to danger and safety, Byron, in contrast, saw a glorious mirror showing images of the almighty, eternity, and death, and he also used the ocean as an image of a kind of freedom from all kinds of human laws. The next example is to show how writers of the sea might erase the portrayal of the pragmatic struggle to read the Book of the Water, even when they were strongly inspired by it. One of the most famous examples of such erasure is by the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge in his Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which was published first in a collaboration with another romantic poet equally fond of landscape, William Wordsworth, the Lyrical Ballads in 1798. As our keynote speaker after lunch, Jonathan Lamb, has detailed, Coleridge was inspired in this ballad by his reading of a long tradition of South Sea exploration literature, a literature most famous in his lifetime in the immensely popular accounts of the voyages of Cook, which I'll have more to say about later, and which stretch back to the early modern period. And these works are crowded, I'm sure, as you know, with pragmatic details written for other mariners in the government and people who commissioned these voyages, although they also entertained armchair sailors. However, Coleridge erases all these details, and he makes his navigation archaic. He spelled in the original, the Ancient Mariner was marinere. And he uses the solitude of Europeans' ventures across the vast Pacific as the occasion for phantasmagorical fantasies grappling with existential response to the solitude of the human condition. While for Byron, the immensity of the sea led to a liberation, exemplified by his romantic pirates and rebels, for Coleridge, the solitude is the prelude for the mariner and his companions on this doomed voyage to all kinds of irrational behavior, superstition, hallucinatory imagery. And I've just given you one example, which is the nightmare life and death in the last 4 lines of this. Her lips were red, her looks were free, her locks were yellow as gold, her skin was white as leprosy. The nightmare life and death was she who thicks man's blood with cold. Now, it's interesting, for many years, literary critics read this kind of phantasmagoria in psychological and existential terms, whether as a Christian parable about repentance or a pre-Freudian illustration of the repetition compulsion. The mariner has to tell this tale of disaster, and it contaminates everyone who hears it, his listener in the poem, and us as well. However, Jonathan, who's done so much to reconnect literary representations of the ocean with their practice, has excavated how the details of this phantasmagorical account were also inspired by some of the diseases on pioneering South Sea voyage accounts. So, for example, the nightmare life and death recalls not just leprosy, but the decay of scurvy, which had to do with, a pathology of the skin and feverish fantasies. So I guess I'm throwing this out there to invite Jonathan to, talk about his current research, which I think he will do later. So far, my examples of poetic representations of the ocean have been drawn from the literary genre poetry. I also want to make the point that this poetic way of imagining the ocean was also found in prose and non-fictional prose at that. And these fictional representations often adhere to the pretty pictures Twain dismissed when he talked about his own apprenticeship. And Jane Austen is just as tart in her way about the poetic ocean as a commonplace in Persuasion, a novel all about naval officers, which she finished in 1816, although it wasn't published in her lifetime. And her heroine and a companion get up and go to the beach early one morning. I don't have this quote on the PowerPoint. And it was, quote, to watch the flowing of the tide, which a fine southeasterly breeze was bringing in with all the grandeur which so flat a shore admitted. They praised the morning, gloried in the sea, sympathized in the delight of the fresh-feeling breeze, and were silent. And then they turned to gossip about what's going on land and romantic relationships in particular. But in some cases, notably when portraying extreme maritime environments and marine environments, poetry is not ironic, but rather a descriptive tool. So this starts to blur the boundary I'm setting up, but I want to also put that out there. I'm going to read an example from a non-fictional work by the American naturalist, adventurer, and diver William Beebe, his Beneath Tropic Seas in 1928, which was written about Beebe's helmet diving off Haiti in the mid-1920s. I think Beebe was one of the first to describe tropical coral reefs based on extended observation at depth. And I'm making this assertion gingerly in the presence of experts on the human and physical history of the reef. But in any case, Beebe presents himself as one of the first, and his non-fictional book, which was extremely popular, is saturated with poetic imagery, which now is trying to give some sense of the specificity and difference of underwater flora, fauna, and the conditions of underwater perception itself. So he is, in his way, trying to read the Book of the Water, but he's trying to read the Book of the Water with poetic imagery. And I'm about to read you a passage from a chapter, No Man's Land 5 Fathoms Down, so about a coral reef at 30 feet, where he's trying to put into words his observations about underwater color specifically, and the way in which the extraordinarily dense medium of water mutes our experience of colors seen through the atmosphere of air. Before I do that, I'm not going to go into what underwater optics are like and their difference from optics through air, but I just threw up a slide from a manual of underwater photography, the transformation of color itself as light waves penetrate beneath the water's surface and are absorbed by water molecules, which are 800 times denser than air molecules. So Beebe is observing closely, and the unexpected conditions of the environment he finds lead him to a very effusive, extremely poetic language. So he says in the quote that I have up, we need a whole new vocabulary, new adjectives adequately to describe the designs and colors of undersea, and its undersea optics, which are particularly interesting to him, as well as the biology of marine creatures. So he talks about how the very medium of water prevents any garishness. Its pastel perspective compels the most exquisite harmony of tints. Filtered through its softness, the harshest, most gaudy parrotfish resolves into the delicacy of an old Chinese print, an age-mellowed tapestry. If one asks for modernist or futurist designs, no opium dream can compare with a batfish or an angry octopus. So here you have poetic imagery being used to try to express new conditions in reading this Book of the Water, which is an unfolding book, as Twain said, a book which continuously is in the process of transformation. So I want to now turn to the other major strand for imagining the waterways of the globe across the same era, which is the pragmatic imagination. And what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes is try to summarize my entire book, The Novel of the Sea. So you're just going to have to forgive me if what I say is a little bit compressed and compacted. And I'd be happy to be more expansive in questions, whether in the talk or afterwards. Twain's portrayal of the pilot's care and skill comes from a long tradition of writing about work on these waterways, going back to the beginnings of global ocean travel in the 15th century. Narratives such as the South Sea accounts Coleridge was reading, and which indeed were best-selling literature throughout the early modern period and the Enlightenment and into the 19th century. This non-fictional literature led to a cultural fantasy of the skilled mariner as an icon of empowered human agency across the global age of sail. I think in late 20th century America, the equivalent would be Tom Wolfe's construction of American test pilots, who were the prelude to the space program, who had what he called the right stuff, pushing, or what was called the right stuff, pushing in the language of this kind of very macho language, the outside of the envelope of the atmosphere of air. So this cultural fantasy of the mariner as the icon who had the right stuff in the early modern Enlightenment period first made its way into the modern novel with Daniel Defoe's The Life and Strange Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. This book is usually called Robinson Crusoe. It's usually forgotten that he's Mariner of York. And if you look at the title page from the original edition, you can see a ship pitching on the waves in the background to your left of Crusoe in his goatskin costume. This portrayal of the mariner as the icon of empowered agency is at the center of a lineage of sea adventure fiction, which passes through Smollett, Fenimore Cooper, Frederick Marryat, Victor Hugo. Melville has a very ambivalent relationship to it. He takes it apart, even as he evokes it. Victor Hugo's Toilers of the Sea, Stevenson, Conrad, to the works of Patrick OBrien today, to name just a few authors in this tradition. And in this pragmatic way of imagining the sea is not, as in the poetic lineage, an opportunity for aesthetic or existential reflection. Rather, it's an exceptionally dangerous physical space which can be navigated but which cannot be controlled. So they become, the oceans of the globe become an occasion for dramatizing empowered human agency, which contends with all these dangers. And the novel and narrative prose, novels and novellas, are the form where this has been written about the most, but it also makes its way into narrative poetry. You may be familiar, for example, with William Falconer's The Shipwreck, which was a bestseller of the late 18th, early 19th century. This imaginative tradition of representing the ocean as the theater of empowered human agency goes back to antiquity and to the navigations of Odysseus. He was, of course, the paradigmatic ancient seafaring hero who would sail to the Straits of Gibraltar, which marked the edges of the flat classical world, to survive treacherous conditions, including whirlpools, deadly rocks, and storms, as well as the wrath of the god of the sea, Poseidon, Odysseus called on his practical intelligence, which included skills at command, strength, cleverness, and an ability to assess all the strangers he meets, human and gods. However, there's one fundamental difference between the practical intelligence of Odysseus and the pragmatic imagination of the sea in modernity. Odysseus navigated in an enchanted world. And from a pragmatic standpoint, the sea, in contrast, is completely physical, and its vast forces are those of nature. And although providence may be invoked, the opposition is never the devil or deities. Providence is kind of out there as a shadow, but these mariners are not contending directly with gods in fact or fiction. So the pragmatic imagination of the sea in modernity finds its way into the novel from the non-fictional narratives of seamanship and exploration, which proliferated in the global age of sail. Defoe, who originated this genre of sea fiction, was an armchair sailor who counted 49 books of overseas travel in his library. There he found accounts of navigations where men, the world of the sea is almost entirely masculine. There are a couple of examples of pirates who are exceptions, which are kind of piquant, where they survived exceptional hardships and dangers, which at the same time display their practical intelligence. But in these works of nonfiction, as those of you know who've read South Sea voyage accounts, they're more focused on describing the new sea sailed, the conditions observed, rather than the psychology needed to affect that work. So there's a kind of gap in explicit articulation of the psychology of what it took to sail on these seas, and this gap opened the way for the novelist. Since we don't have time here for me to extract the psychology of the mariner, so inspiring for adventure fiction from navigation literature of the period, I'm going to quote from a pithy description of seamanship by Robert Falk, a literary critic, in a book entitled The Sea Voyage Narrative. Along with mastery over a learned body of knowledge derived from past experience and many specific skills in navigation and technology, good seamanship required a distinctive kind of excellence in action, and Falk writes, quote, "The practice of seamanship is often complex, demanding imagination and discrimination more than adherence to fixed rules of procedure. It is an art demanding foresight, initiative, the ability to improvise as seafarers deal with the unpredictable ocean." And feats of improvisation make for some of the most fascinating reading in the non-fictional narratives of maritime labor and exploration. These feats display a kind of practical creativity, which is very different from the romantic creativity divorced from actual application. And this practical creativity occurs when existing technologies and protocols fail under the stress of extraordinary unforeseen circumstances. You could call this capacity jury-rigging, if you wanted to use a nautical term, a temporary makeshift to bring a disabled vessel back to harbor. A jury-rig is a contrivance of masts and sails to get a ship underway after she has been disabled. And the annals of navigation are filled with this creativity, this kind of jury-rigging sensibility, both on the small and the large scale. Here's a small-scale example. This is in a work by William Dampier, A New Voyage Around the World from 1697, which was the best-selling work of travel literature at the turn of the 18th century, and which Defoe was in bitter competition with Dampier for a share of the market. He even wrote a book called A New Voyage Around the World by a course he never sailed before, which was a fictional account of adventures. But there are all kinds of small acts of jury-rigging, which are part of the pleasure of reading this book. So here's one when Dampier describes how he preserved the journals of his travels. That would be the basis of his account when he crossed the Isthmus of Darien, which was entailed fording a number of rivers. Foreseeing the necessity of wading through rivers frequently in our land march, I took care before I left the ship to provide myself a large joint of bamboo, which I stopped at both ends, closing it with wax so as to keep out any water. In this, I preserved my journal and other writings from being wet, though I was often forced to swim. So there's this kind of creativity in improvising watertight shell for his writing. I guess at the other end, extreme and tragic jury-rigging would be survival cannibalism. And now I want to give you an example of one of the most famous feats of jury rigging in the annals of exploration, which occurred. Blimey, okay. When James Cook and his crew saved the Endeavour in their near shipwreck when they first came upon the Great Barrier Reef in June 1770. And so I thought I would just include a clip of a dramatic account of that episode from Ian's website, The Reef, which I would encourage you to explore on the human history of the Great Barrier Reef. And maybe we could see it.
On the night of June 9th, disaster strikes as the Endeavour is impaled on a coral reef. Water rushes in and all hands are at the ship's 3 pumps to prevent it from sinking. With the morning's high tide, they manage to free the ship from the coral reef, but they are still taking on water. Then a young midshipman called Monkhouse persuades Cook to try an unusual technique called bothering.
Bothering consists of taking a stretch of canvas and sewing loosely into it chunks of oakum, that is rough rope, chunks of sheep's wool and chunks of sheep's dung. And you then take the stretch of canvas over the belly of the ship to where there's the big wound, and it gets sucked into it by the force of the water going in. And as it does so, it dislodges all this filth and drives it into the wound as a blocking device that stops the ship from sinking, at least we hope. And at this moment, the Endeavour is saved, temporarily at least, by a handful of sheep shit.
The ship limped for the shore. By Thursday, 14th of June, Cook had discovered a narrow channel through the coral reef leading to a spot on the mangrove banks.
So fathering, I think, is a premier example of this kind of creativity, this practical creativity. It includes deviation of axis. The sail shifts from the vertical to the horizontal, from its function to capture energy, to something which is the energy of the wind and the air, something which is underneath the ship, and of course, sheep shit, as you say, goes from being something that is detritus to this temporary patch, which stops the terrible leaks briefly, which have been caused by running up on the coral. Along with this creative improvisation, there's one more aspect from non-fictional navigation literature which is essential to its entrance into the novel, and I just want to talk briefly about that. And that is the type of situation which calls on this creative improvisation when existing technologies and protocols break down. And these situations were what was set down in a category from the ship's log called accidents and occurrences. I've just reproduced here a page from a book that was reprinted many times in the late 17th, early 18th century about the Art of Navigation by James Atkinson. Initially, it kept on getting revised, Epitome of the Art of Navigation. This is a 1753 edition, and you can see the description of a journal or sea reckoning as a punctual writing down every day of the course, distance, difference of latitude, longitude, and departure the ship hath made, what latitude and longitude she is in, and then here's the category which is so inspiring to novelists, the category where creative imagination is usually displayed the fullest, the wind and weather with all accidents and occurrences that happened. And in fact, when James Cook drafted a journal of his first navigation with an eye towards posterity, although it wasn't published in his lifetime, he subtitled it Remarkable Occurrences on Board His Majesty's Bark Endeavour. Other terms for such unusual situations over the edge of technology and protocol were strange and uncommon, surprising and extraordinary. Here's Cook's journal, where you can see, this is actually from the second expedition near the Arctic Circle, where you can see how he adheres to the protocols of the log that Atkinson lays out, and this is what I want to come to, which is the remarkable occurrences from his journal. Non-fictional maritime travel accounts in journals such as Dampier's and Cook's are diffuse. They record all kinds of information for its potential interest and usefulness within the general framework of a 24-hour day, even in situations of crisis. So you might compare Cook's account of fathering, which is in the midst of what happened on June 13th, 1770, to the dramatic narration in The Reef, which hones in specifically on that gesture of creative improvisation in a manner that is actually quite similar to a lot of the novelists making use of this literature. And what Defoe does in Robinson Crusoe is to take the craft of the mariner, and in particular this creativity, and to imagine a remarkable occurrence on steroids, going beyond any castaway narrative found over the 2 centuries in the annals of navigation that were his inspiration. It's a mariner cast away for 28 years on an island. But it's also to organize the remarkable occurrence to create suspense using an episodic plot of problem and solution. The remarkable occurrence is recast as a problem, and then there's a display of skill, which calls on all the different aspects of seamanship that I've been talking about, but in particular highlights this creative imagination. And this leads to a solution which can then create a new problem in its turn. And were we in a group of literary scholars, I could break down for you how all this works. But all I just really want to emphasize here is the creativity, this practical creativity. I'll just give you one example, very early example of this kind of creativity in problem solving, which is actually an example of jury rigging when Crusoe is first stranded on the island. And he has the ship he was on that's wrecked offshore, and he needs to get the items to shore, so he swims out there, and he discovers things that are quite useful to him, like a toolbox and gunpowder, and he faces the problem of how to get all this to land. And the first step is to take a cache of jury masts, spare masts that were kept in case they needed to do repairs, and to cut them up and to make a raft out of them. And this is kind of an emblem of this beginnings of creative improvisation. And this mundane feat is at the start of Crusoe's step-by-step methodical construction of a comfortable home from his island exile. Sometimes the improvisation has to do with engineering, sometimes it has to do with manipulation, psychological manipulation, particularly in the second half of the novel when he actually encounters people. And sometimes at its most kind of philosophical, it has to do with jury rigging new kinds of morality out of existing systems of belief. So I'll just give you one example. After he finds a footprint in the sand, right? A footprint, so we know cannibals are coming when you find a footprint in literature in this era. So what to do about the cannibals will preoccupy Crusoe for pages of the novel, and he will engage in thought experiment after thought experiment about how to eradicate their scourge. But finally, he hits on the creative improvisation of doing nothing, jury rigging a new kind of expeditious morality. And I just highlighted the key phrase. He goes through all kinds of rationalizations, and he says, religion joined in this with this prudential resolution. So he joins religion and the principles of Christianity that might consider cannibals as scourges to be eradicated, with pragmatism and a touch of Montaigne also, for those of you who are familiar with Montaigne's essay on cannibals. And he comes up with the decision to just to stop and wait in the service of his own self-preservation. Okay, I just want to give you in the remainder of the talk a couple of more examples of the power of this jury rigging or creative improvisation throughout the history of sea fiction. I jumped from the 1719 to 1823. It's interesting that the period 1750 to 1823, there are not to my knowledge, famous works of sea fiction which have been written, and this may be because the non-fictional accounts of South Sea Voyage narratives at the time were so compelling that they were kind of taking up that niche in the market. I don't know. In any case, it's a kind of thought-provoking absence. The genre was reanimated by James Fenimore Cooper, the American, and kind of as a claim for the new national American novel, along with novels about westward expansion. He wrote novels about America's maritime empire. And the first novel was that he wrote in the seafaring vein was The Pilot, 1824, whose hero is the Scottish John Paul Jones, leading American raids off the coast of Scotland during the War of Independence. And here, this creativity is above all in feats of navigation. And we're shown it from the beginning when the pilot is introduced with the challenge of navigating through the Devil's Grip, a narrow, treacherous passage around a point into the open sea, fighting against the tide and shifting winds occasioned by a violent storm that's just beginning to break. And all the traits of seamanship mentioned by Falk are visible in the maneuvering of the vessel, but there comes a moment when they're not enough to clear the point and get the ship into the open sea, and at that moment, this practical creativity proves the key to success, and it all hinges on using more sail rather than less sail, despite the extremely strong winds. And I'll just read you a little section from it where you can see how Cooper keeps on pointing to the fact that this is really a kind of daring maneuver by having the crew or the officers on board object to it. If we had beaten out the way we entered, exclaimed Griffith, we should have done well. Say also if the tide would have let us do so, returned the pilot calmly, that's John Paul Jones. Gentlemen, we must be prompt. The topsail is not enough to keep her up to the wind. We want both jib and mainsail. 'Tis a perilous thing to loosen canvas in such a tempest, observed the doubtful captain. It must be done, returned the collected stranger. We perish without it. See, already the sea casts us to leeward. The order of the lieutenant was executed almost as soon as issued, and everything being ready, the enormous folds of the mainsail were trusted loose to the blast. There was an instant when the result was doubtful. The tremendous thrusting of the heavy sail seemed to bid defiance to all restraint, shaking the ship to her center. But art and strength prevailed, and gradually the canvas was distended, and bellying as it fills was drawn down to its usual place by the power of 100 men. She feels it, she springs her luff, the pilot responds joyfully. If only she'll bear her canvas, we shall go clear. So this kind of going in the face of all protocol, but managing to kind of find the expedient out of the impasse is the hallmark of this kind of creative imagination in the pilot's seamanship. Let me give you one last example from Joseph Conrad, who was a great admirer of Cooper and wrote about him in an essay, Tales of the Sea. And in Conrad's novel and novellas, the challenges requiring this kind of creative improvisation are not adverse physical conditions or hostile navies, but rather they're the dark sea within human psychology. From Lord Jim to Typhoon, from Heart of Darkness to The Secret Sharer, the performance of seamanship in Conrad is impeded by the perversity and the kind of tortures of the human psyche. As Conrad memorably phrased this type of obstacle in his author's note to Typhoon, the interest is, quote, not the bad weather, but the extraordinary complication brought into the ship's life at a moment of exceptional stress by the human element below her deck. The extraordinary complication brought by the human element below her deck. So it's with an example of a novella by Conrad where the mariner's practical intelligence triumphs over the human element, and it doesn't always, as of course you know, that I'll end. And this novella is The Secret Sharer. As you may remember, the novella represents the challenges facing a young captain on his first command of a merchant ship in the Gulf of Siam. Rather than a cold embodiment of his profession, like Cooper's The Pilot, Conrad's young captain is racked by the pressure of authority. The novella opens when he inexplicably, immediately violates the trust in him as a commander by taking on board a renegade officer named Leggett, who has killed another sailor. After his first action, the unnamed young captain harbors Leggett secretly in his captain in a homosocial, if not homosexual, relationship. At the end of the novella, the captain risks running his ship aground by bringing it too near the shore of an island in order for Leggett to escape. And Conrad recapitulates the suspenseful episode of clearing a point we saw in Cooper, but it's a mission that's undertaken by a captain under the pressure of some passion which he never really unfolds, and which of course has led to a lot of critical discussion, rather than any sort of immediate pressures of strategy or threats from the weather. And yet, at the last minute, there's this kind of practical creativity which saves the ship and restores the young captain to his professional position. On parting with Leggett, the captain has impulsively given him a hat to shade him from the sun. It's a useless gesture for a swimming person to have a hat with him, and it slips off his head. But floating in the darkness, it becomes a practical marker, enabling the captain to gauge that his ship has started to slip backwards. So here's the passage from The Secret Share. He's gotten too near the shore. He's trying to gauge, is his ship making headway? And he doesn't have any kind of a marker in the darkness, and then he sees this white hat. All at once, my strained, yearning stare distinguished a white object floating within a yard of the ship's side, white on the black water, a phosphorescent flash passed under it. What was that thing? I recognized my own floppy hat. It must have fallen off his head, and he didn't bother. Now I had what I wanted, the saving mark for my eyes. And I watched the hat, the expression of my sudden pity for his mere flesh. It had been meant to save his homeless head from the dangers of the sun, and now, behold, it was saving the ship. And what he can gauge from the ship's relationship to the hat is that the ship is actually slipping backwards, and he then needs to shift the helm, because when a ship is drifting backwards, the steering is on the other side from when it's going forward. So he says, shift the helm, I said in a low voice to the seaman standing still like a statue, and this maneuver then manages to get the ship around onto a tack where the sails start to fill and prevents a disaster. So such gestures of creative improvisation, practical improvisation, have been dramatized across this pragmatic way of imagining the sea. Sea adventure fiction has made for enjoyable reading across history, and yet until quite recently, literary critics did not devote much study to it, certainly in comparison to their fondness for the poetic imagination of the sea. I think there are two reasons for this avoidance, or rather two types of reasons. In our own era, when all but sailors have forgotten this craft, it's particularly hard to understand the significance of the details in the nautical language. So, for example, I owe the explanation of the maneuvering in The Secret Sharer to an article called Seamanship in Conrad's The Secret Sharer by Mary Lowe Schenck. And a telling example of this loss would be in the novels of Patrick OBrien, who really leads you step by step through the kinds of maneuvers which Cooper or Conrad just present as if they were self-evident knowledge, and who pillages this entire history, moreover, it should be said. Another more interesting explanation for why people have not discussed this pragmatic creativity, I think, is that it challenges our assumptions about the ethical mission of literature. Looking back on skilled seamanship nostalgically at the end of the working age of sail, Conrad presented what this kind of skilled seamanship, what he called craft, quite glamorously, and this is the final quote, as more than technique, more than honesty. It's something wider, embracing honesty and grace and rule in an elevated and clear sentiment, not altogether utilitarian, which may be called the honor of labor. It is made up of accumulated tradition, kept alive by individual pride, rendered exact by professional opinion, and like the higher arts, it is spurred on and sustained by discriminating praise. But in fact, this honor, Conrad's honor of labor, is a tricky thing. It's indeed excellence in practice, and yet it's a kind of human agency which is amoral in and of itself. Across the history of global ocean travel and its literary expression as well, Conrad's craft manifests an admirable, at times incredible, ability to navigate situations of great danger and risk with limited resources. With concerns of safety and knowledge paramount, it eschews ideology in favor of survival, like Crusoe's refusal to judge the cannibals. At the same time, it's opportunistic and immoral. Effectiveness is the basis for assessing such honor of labor rather than right or wrong, and it's used by captains of slave ships, by pirates, by merchants out profit, by colonial expeditions, even while it retains a certain kind of admirability as excellence in practice. The pragmatic imagination of the sea in adventure fiction is, in short, dramatizing a creative, or it is a creative, generative, and yet troubling strand in the entangled, multivalent formation we call modern reason. Western ways of representing the waterways of the globe. The first is what I'm going to call the poetic way of imagining these waterways as an opportunity for aesthetic appreciation. And the second is what I'll call the pragmatic imagination of the waters as an opportunity to dramatize the human capacity for practical action. So I owe this distinction between the poetic and the pragmatic imagination of the waters to the American journalist, humorist, and novelist Mark Twain, when he described a fundamental shift in his relation to the aquatic space. And this shift occurs in the first part of Life in the Mississippi, which was published in 1883. Twain works as a pilot in the late 1850s until the start of the American Civil War, and some people have said if there hadn't been a Civil War, he might have never gone on to a career as a writer. At the time he was a pilot, the banks of the Mississippi, which is the fourth longest river in the world, following the Nile, the Amazon, and the Yangtze, were extraordinarily unstable. The levee engineering projects of the later 19th century had not yet been undertaken, and in fact they were in the works when and thank you for inviting me in. It's exciting and a little daunting to be giving the first talk launching this festival, bringing together people from such diverse areas of research and expression around our common interest in the oceans. I understand my role today as opening up the question of how the seas have been represented in literature, to frame my own research and areas of study in a way that could highlight their value for other kinds of questions about the history and practice of the marine environment. So rather than focusing on my book, The Novel in the Sea, as I had originally envisioned, I think I want to be very schematic, but introduce you to what I think are two fundamental passage. Indeed, it was more than that. It was a legend of the largest capitals with a string of shouting exclamation points at the end of it. For it meant that a wreck or a rock was buried there that could tear the life out of the strongest vessel that ever floated. It is the faintest and simplest expression the water ever makes, and the most hideous to a pilot's eye. In truth, the passenger who could not read this book saw nothing but all manner of pretty pictures in it, painted by the sun and shaded by the clouds, whereas to the trained eye, these were not pictures at all, but the grimmest and most dead earnest of reading matter. If Twain allies this view of the water as an objective contemplation, as an object of contemplation with landscape and poetry, it's because this poetic view was prominent in romantic lineage of landscape poetry, which used the seascape, like other landscapes, as the opportunity for metaphoric expressions about the human psyche and existential questions about the human condition. So I know you're all familiar with prominent poets in the seascape lineage. They include Byron, Shelley, Keats, Baudelaire, Swinburne, Rimbaud, Valéry, many, many. While I lived, all the grace, the beauty, the poetry had gone out of the majestic river. So it's with the grace, the beauty, and the poetry of the waters that I want to start. And then after I give you some examples of that, I'll turn to a more pragmatic relationship. And in fact, Twain is already suggesting that the pragmatic relationship has a literary correlate as well. He talks about the book of the waters and learning to read the face of the water. He says, "The face of the water in time became a wonderful book, a book that was a dead language to the uneducated passenger, but which told its mind to me without reserve." And this is after he's learned to become a pilot. "There never was so wonderful a book written by man, never one whose interest was so absorbing, so unflagging, so sparklingly renewed with every reperusal." And here comes the contrast between the poetic and the pragmatic way of looking at the water. "The passenger who could not read it was charmed with the peculiar sort of faint dimple on its surface, on the rare occasion when he did not overlook it altogether. But to the pilot, that was an italicized." Twain published Life in the Mississippi, and he was skeptical of their outcome. He wrote, 10,000 river commissions, this was the organization charged with this, with the minds of the world at their back, cannot tame that lawless stream, cannot curb it or confine it, cannot say to it, go here, go there, and make it obey, cannot save a shore which it has sentenced, cannot bar its path with an obstruction which it will not tear down, dance over, and laugh at. To pilot safely, as Twain describes, he had to memorize the banks and markers on the entire course he navigated, which in his case was about 1,250 miles, and then retaining this map in his memory, compare it to the shifts that had occurred since he had last followed its course. But the price of this arduous apprenticeship, in his words, was the loss of the ability to appreciate the beauty of the many majestic scenes he encountered. So this is the first quote I have up there. "When I had mastered the language of this water and had come to know every trifling feature that bordered the great river as familiarly as I knew the letters of the alphabet, I had made a valuable acquisition. But I had lost something too. I had lost something which could never be restored to